Hi, thank you so much for having me as a speaker today. My name's Tom Christie, and I'm going to be talking today about being an open source citizen. Hopefully, even about being a good open source citizen, whatever good means. This talk is going to be a mixed collection of lessons that I personally learned along the way, some of which I wish I'd known sooner. Perhaps something in here will help you along the way too. So, let's get stuck in. Firstly, a little bit about my story. I'm probably most well known in the Python community as the author of Django REST Framework, which is a project that helps developers build web APIs. I started working on Django REST Framework as a side project in 2009, and since then it's grown and grown. Today, it's in GitHub projects, is downloaded around 1 million times per week, has had over 1,000 individuals contribute to the project in one way or another, and is used by teams and businesses worldwide. Currently, I work on open source full-time. I have a small business Encode OSS that's funded entirely through a sponsorship model. So my first significant open source project started back in 2011. I had an idea about how we could be building web APIs in a way that would allow users to interact with them directly through the web browser. It seemed very odd to me at the time that the base that we were building couldn't be interacted with in the same way that the web pages and the websites we were building could be. And I was really motivated by this idea and started working on Django REST Framework as a side project, which grew and grew in popularity. And after several years, the project had become pretty well known in the Django ecosystem. So I had a whole bunch of work that I wanted to take on for a new release at that time, and could see it wasn't going to be sustainable to keep working on purely in my own time. So I launched a crowd-funded campaign through the Kickstarter platform. At the time, I was working with a great little web agency who were really supportive of my open source work, and we negotiated a way that I'd be able to spend part of my time with the web agency working on their client projects and part of the time on my open source work. When we got a little further down the road, I was really fortunate with the timing that Mozilla happened to launch an open source grants program, which REST Framework was fortunate enough to be awarded one of the grants for. I had a whole chunk of work that I continued to want to be working on with Django REST Framework at the time. But at that point, I didn't want to run with another Kickstarter type campaign where there was a big chunk of funding that came in at once and then would work and work and work, and eventually the money would run out. Instead, I wanted to have a sustainably funded model. So back in 2016, when I was awarded that grant, it gave me enough runway to launch a sustainably funded sponsorship model, set up my own small business, and start working on open source completely full-time. In the last 5 years, since I've been working with this business, I've been able to then continue and take that and work on a bunch of other software as well, particularly working in the async space. So developing the Overcorn web and the Starlet's web framework, which Fast API uses substantially, and also working on an HTTP client, HTTPX. In that time, Some of what I've done well. Some of what I've done not so well. But I'd like to hope that my work has had an overall positive impact in the world. And either way, I'm going to be sharing with you some lessons that I've learned over the last decade. So number one for me here is it's about communication. So as developers, we understandably often tend to focus on the technology itself. What language are you working with? What tools you're working with? What packages to rely on? How to lay out your project? What framework to build on top of? Which language features to use? And as important as these things may be, they're not the number one thing that I would emphasize. The single most important skill that you can be working on is how you communicate with others. Spending time learning to communicate well will reward you more than any other skill in this industry. The ability to express yourself clearly, simply, and efficiently. The clue's in the name: programming languages. It's all about communication and thinking through communication. Working on your communication skills will allow you to work together with teams productively and enjoyably, will help your business deliver on its actual goals rather than focusing unproductively on the less important details of the software development process. Clear communication is also clear thinking. Next up, teamwork makes the dream work. Good teamwork is essential to the success of your project. Be mindful about how much space you're taking up in a conversation and make sure that everybody's voice is heard. Listen attentively. We all bring different sets of skills to our projects, with something to learn from everyone on the team. Make sure you're valuing the various different roles on the team or within your business that you're working with. Sales, marketing, project management, front-end, back-end, operation, each requires different strengths. Don't value your own particular skill set more highly than others. For every area where you have a strength, you'll have another weakness in a different area. It's all about teamwork. Drop the ego. This is something else that I think is important in working in this landscape. So when working on unpaid open source software, there's an element in what we're doing that is essentially attention-seeking behavior. If we're not being paid for our work, but we're spending time promoting and pushing it in front of others, then what we're doing is engaging in a human behavior, a very human behavior, that's seeking the validation and attention of others, which is okay. That's a completely normal and human thing to do and can be a positive thing. It can be a driver and a motivation for you to do good work. But there is something there that you also need to be careful around. Putting too much emphasis on your own self-promotion can make you blind to others around you. If you're bringing yourself up, be really careful that you're not doing it in a way that brings others down. It's not about removing the ego, but it is about making sure that it knows its place. Okay, maintain your balance. So what am I talking about with this one? One very, very common problem that most open source projects end up having is that there's an ever-increasing pile of issues and pull requests. Most times when a project gets successful, or even a little bit successful, it just starts to become swamped with more and more issues being contributed by contributors to the project than the maintainers are actually able to deal with and keep on top of. As a contributor to an open source project, it's very easy to put yourself in a position where you're acting with great intentions, but at the same time, you're also creating more work for the maintenance team. And that's something to really be mindful of. The good news is that you can be part of helping to address this and solve this. The thing that I would say here is to try and consider the number of issues that you're opening against the number of issues that you're helping to close as well. Don't always think first of, okay, I have something that I would like to address. I'm going to create an issue for it. You can come to a project and think, okay, I have something that I'd like to try and work on. But first, I'm going to go and take a look at the existing issues. Is there something that I can get stuck in and help to close at the same time as this new thing that I'm opening? So that you're helping maintain that balance between the number of issues that are being opened and the number of issues that are being closed. You can help move issues towards resolution in quite small steps. You don't have to take on trying to completely resolve an issue. Simple steps that you can take here include some relatively basic things. For example, if you read through an issue that hasn't had a response yet, are you able to understand the issue that's being presented there? Does it make sense to you? If it doesn't make sense to you, then it probably doesn't make sense to the maintainer either, or at least not without them putting in a whole chunk of work trying to get through it. So it might be helpful in that situation for you to ask the person who's opens up that issue, can you explain this bit more clearly to me? If you can understand the issue, are you able to reproduce it on your own machine? Are you able to demonstrate that the issue that somebody has reported also shows up for you as well? If you can, remarking about that on a ticket is a really good plan. It takes a chunk of work away from the maintainer because they've already seen that more than one person is able to demonstrate this issue. So it will help them to then prioritize the issue more highly. And finally, of course, if you're able to, you can try taking on a pull request to close an open issue. And taking on pull requests to close issues that aren't your own is a great way to offset any work that you're in turn asking a maintainer to help you with. Okay, go slow. So this, I suppose, is more a lesson for project maintainers. Certainly it's something that I've learned the value of over my time working with the various projects that I've been on. Sometimes when, as a maintainer, if you're always rushing in and trying to do the work that you feel needs doing on a project, the effect that you can have by doing that is that you might not necessarily be creating enough space for other folks to get involved as well. You don't always need to rush. Taking your time and going steady over resolving issues and pull requests can be a benefit. That allows time and space for other folks to chime in as well and start getting involved in the project. Maintaining an open source project is always a marathon, not a sprint. Okay, discussions first. So for all of the projects that we work on through my little Encode OSS business these days, all of our projects that our teams work on, we have a policy of discussions first. And I think that this is something that's really helpful for a lot of projects. So our policy is that we request contributors start any of their interactions with the projects with a discussion rather than raising an issue on GitHub. They're able to do this either through the GitHub Discussions tab, or they can do it more informally in the community chat space. Not all discussions need to be escalated into a GitHub issue. The big advantage of having a discussion space first is really to do with the differing workflow around discussions and issues. Issues end up acting like an inbox of growing tasks. They remain open unless a maintainer puts in the required work to close the issue and explain why they've done so. Discussions are a little different because they don't have an open or closed status, and there's no requirement for a maintainer to necessarily do anything about a discussion at all. It just creates less of an, I've always got to keep on taking things out of this pile, or it's just going to keep endlessly growing. That doesn't happen with the discussions, but it does with the issues. It also helps to create two different kinds of spaces. So you have the issue space, which represents the pile of tasks that the team intends to take on. And then you have a discussion space, which is open for anyone to pitch in on. And having those two different spaces makes it easier for folks looking at your projects to see what's actively being prioritized by the team. So they can come, and the issues space really ought to reflect stuff that the team really is keen on getting going on or have on their roadmap somewhere down the line. Whereas the discussion space, anybody can say, I think this might be an issue. Can we talk about it? Have a bit of a conversation. And then if one of the maintainers thinks, oh yeah, okay, we're happy to dedicate our time helping you work on this, let's start doing that. Then it can be escalated up into an issue. Okay, another one of the lessons, one thing at a time. When you're working through an issue with the team, a really good tactic to improve your communication is to really just make sure in your conversation flow, you just deal with one thing at a time. In a thread of conversation, if you make a remark that asks several different questions, each of which could have a different answer, then the conversation doesn't really flow. The conversation flows much more fluidly when you keep it directed and focused. So if you've got a few different questions about, should we do things one way or another, try just to ask one of those things first. Which thing is the most important to you? Ask that thing first and help the conversation stay on track in that way. And that one thing at a time mantra, as well as being something that is helpful around communication and issues, is also really important for pull requests. There's so many pull requests that come into projects can have a tendency to lump in a whole chunk of different bits of work together. As a maintainer, I find that a much more productive way to approach pull requests is the each pull request should really tend to be the absolute minimum piece of work that makes sense in itself. If you've got something that addresses a few different pieces of work, really just try to find split it out into several different pull requests and just make each one in turn, one at a time. That will stop your pull requests getting bogged down in overly complicated reviews, and it will just help ensure that you get better quality reviews of the work that you're doing, because there aren't too many different things going on at one point in time. So rather than taking big leaps, instead what you're aiming for is to take the smallest possible step in the right direction and keep walking. Step, step, step. One simple step at a time. One thing at a time. Keep it simple. When you're submitting an issue to an open source project, it's really important to keep it as simple as possible. So the more complex your example, the more work you're asking the project maintenance team to do on your behalf. So help them to help you. When you put in the work, they'll reciprocate and put in the work for you as well. Wherever possible, take the example that you're presenting and figure out what you can remove to make it more simple while still demonstrating the issue. And when I say simple, I mean really, really simple. Almost every time I see an issue come into a project I'm working on, there is more work that could be done to trim it down to something just a little bit smaller, and then smaller again, and then smaller again. Really try to minimize the amount of code that you need to reproduce the issue. Can you remove any of the packages that you're working on and present an example that doesn't have any dependencies? Ideally, when you're presenting an issue to a team to try and help you resolve, it ought to be something that they could just really simply copy, paste, and then see the behavior that you're describing without having to do any extra work on their behalf. Also, if you really put the effort into doing this, then much of the time you'll end up debugging the issue that you're having simply by breaking the problem down further and further until you've actually identified for yourself what was going wrong in the first place. Okay, next lesson. Docs first is a great approach. So we often hear about test first pull requests, but you can actually go a step further than that to docs first. And it's not something that I see discussed much or prioritized much, but when it is done, I find it really, really nice. So if you're starting a pull request, if you start your pull request not with the entire chunk of work that you're doing, but only with the documentation changes that you want to see. I mean, this is for feature requests rather than bug fixes, but for feature requests. If you start your pull request just with the new or changed documentation that you would like to see, then you're really helping focus that initial chunk of review and conversation in the right place, which is on the end user, because the documentation is how the end user is going to be using your software. That's what they see. So presenting here's what I think we should add to the project through the documentation is in a great place for yourself and the project maintainer to then start a discussion about, do we want this functionality? Do we want this functionality to look like this? And more than that, what's really motivating this functionality? Why might our users want this? Are we explaining to our users what the value is of this new feature that we're adding? And once you've then had that conversation and review and worked through any changes that you might need to the documentation, then if that's all been accepted and signed off, then you're in a great position to then be able to go, okay, written the documentation, now let's write the tests, now let's write the code. Okay. Another lesson, so we have the best software is no software at all. Whenever you consider making a feature request to a project, or whenever you're working on your own project and you're thinking about adding something to it, remember that the best software is no software at all. So the fantastic thing about having no software is that it requires absolutely minimal maintenance effort. It takes no time at all to implement, and the design decisions around having no software are very, very easy to make. When we enjoy coding for the sake of coding, it can be very easy to slide into creating more work for ourselves than we really need to do. There's a lot of software in the world, and we don't necessarily need to be endlessly inventing and reinventing. There's probably a tool out there that already does what you need, or you might not really need that extra functionality or configuration option that you're considering for your project. For somebody who's saying the best software is no software at all, I'm hugely guilty in this regard. I've written far more software than one person really should. I probably need to stop now. I might do. That might be nice. Yeah, the best software really is no software at all. If you can make do with existing tools, great. If you can find a way to avoid adding extra things for your users to think about in your project, great. Next up, acknowledge others. So this is really important. When you're working on an open source project, always make sure that you're acknowledging other projects and other people working in the same space as you. Point them out clearly on your project README and discuss the positives and the negatives in each case. When somebody is writing or working with a project and they're able to take a good analytical approach to demonstrating and pointing out the alternatives, then as a potential user of that project, I'm much, much more likely to trust their judgment. It's not about, when we're doing this, one project winning out over other projects. If users are choosing your project, you want them to be choosing it for genuinely good reasons, which ought to include being aware of what the alternatives are. When we're working in the open source space, I think what we want to be encouraging is genuinely collaborative behavior rather than competitive behavior. Also, when you acknowledge other work in the same space as the projects that you're working on, your work is much more likely to be better as a result because you're forcing yourself to look properly at what other folks have done in the same space. And most of all, when we acknowledge others, we're building trust and empathy within the community. As we acknowledge others, they in turn will acknowledge us, and we help build that feeling of all working together with different ways and different approaches, but all helping each other out and trying to do the best for each other that we can do. Next lesson, and of course, with all of these lessons, some of them might hold true for you in some cases and some might not, but I mentioned that because with this one, perhaps there will be times when it does not hold true for you, but as a general rule in our industry, at least from what I have seen on the whole, it seems to me that so-called performance tends to be overvalued. It tends to be overvalued when making a choice about which library or packages we rely on. Generally, it's not the first thing that you should be looking at. The really important stuff is how well documented, how well maintained, how reliable, how much risk is this project going to bring? Does it deliver the functionality that we need? So focus your time and energy on a well-constructed code base with the right data models. If you focus on those kinds of things, you're far more likely to be achieving good outcomes than when there's too much focus on so-called performance. Moreover, by keeping things simple and focusing on the simplicity and the reliability of the stack, you're quite likely to also be building something that is likely to scale reasonably well or be adaptable if you are fortunate enough that your service starts getting enough traffic or users for performance to be a concern. Another thing worth saying in this area is that benchmarks are almost never indicative of the performance that you'll see in real-world cases. Be very, very wary about attaching very much importance to benchmarks at all, unless you're really being very careful about analyzing exactly why you're paying attention to them and what you're looking at. Okay, what have we got now? Size matters. So what I'd like to talk about here is about the value in software of keeping things lightweight wherever possible. So all software complexity comes with risk. The more complex your software stack is, the less you'll be able to judge those risks or fully understand the system that you're working with. When it comes to size in software, small often wins. Aim for projects with fewer dependencies, or if they do have dependencies, make sure they're well-maintained and reliable ones. The more software you're depending on, the greater the risk factor of something somewhere in the stack breaking during an upgrade. And also, the small means there's less stuff for you to debug if something isn't working the way that you expect. So the fewer layers that you have in your software stack to dig through in order to really understand what's going on, the better. Keep the API small. If you're working on a software project, keeping the API as minimal as possible is really valuable. You're looking for the absolute minimum amount of API surface area that fulfills the functionality required. Maybe this is slightly odd, I don't know, but for me, I sometimes think of this concept as a project having a shape, where the inside contents of the shape are the functionality and the outer surface area is the API. So to minimize the API surface area, software should be round, spherical, not having several different edges and jaggy shapes. Another analogy that you can use, another way you can think about the benefits of keep the API small approach is like pathways in a landscape or a jungle or through some grassland. If you present users with several different ways to interact with your API or to walk through the jungle, then each user will take a different route. You end up with several different pathways, each of which are only lightly trodden on. But when there's only a single way to do things, everyone takes the same route every time, and a well-trodden path starts to develop. Whenever users are sharing examples with each other, they'll all look similar to each other. When somebody runs into an issue, they're much more likely to be able to find somebody else who submitted a similar issue already. It helps to start to build up a common set of shared knowledge about when I work with this tool, this is how I do it. Whenever possible, avoid giving your users configuration options if you can pick a sensible default for them. Adding extra controls often just gives users more to think about than is really necessary for them. The Python formatting tool Black is a great standout example here, where previous formatting tools presented users with various different options. Black took a zero configuration approach that says, this is how your code should be formatted. And doing that removed any need for discussion about what configuration settings should or shouldn't be used with the tool, because we can spend our time more productively elsewhere. Next up, don't try to be too clever. One of the most common differences that I tend to see between junior developers and senior developers is that junior developers look for clever solutions, while senior developers look for dumb solutions. Maybe that's just me, I don't know. The more experience I've gained along the way, the more I've become comfortable with preferring uncleverness. Learning that it's okay to say, I don't understand, can you walk me through this? Or this approach seems too complicated to me. It's quite easy to fall into the trap of not wanting to admit, I find this a little bit complicated, because we tend to all want to appear smart or clever. But actually, it's really valuable to be able to just go, okay, that seems a bit complicated for me. A good example where this can come into play when we're writing software as well as with software abstractions. We'll often build abstractions in order to make repeated types of work simpler. But when we're doing this, we're actually burying complexity into the system. It's perfectly okay to take the dumb approach too sometimes, and just have a little bit of copy and paste of some code that has a simple repeated pattern throughout it. There's not actually that much harm in sometimes repeating yourself a little bit, if it helps make sure that it's more obvious to users reading your software exactly how that works with a little bit less magic. No, it's a balancing act. What have we got next? We have be transparent. So really, the open source movement has completely and utterly changed the digital landscape over the course of my working career. When I started working as a developer 20 years ago, there were parts of open source that seemed slightly like a fringe element. Now it's completely mainstream. Open source has won. And that huge success of the open source movement shows just how valuable transparency is when we're working as a team and building things together. By opening up how our software works, by allowing other people visibility onto how it works, by allowing others visibility onto how we're working with it, by allowing other people to see what our working processes are like, what our conversations are like, what our workflows are. We're creating, all the time we're doing that, we're creating really, really valuable learning opportunities for everybody who's interested to come and learn from. And the value of that transparency, it extends past the code base, but also into, with open source organizations or with teams, into process and governance issues. So the more you're able to document your processes, or how does somebody join the team, the more you're able to open up the way that you work, the more you're creating oversight and learning opportunities for others who are interested in your project or interested in learning from your project. Okay, hold yourself accountable. Don't be afraid to take on board constructive criticism from others around your communication style or your work. When there's criticism, listen to it, consider it, and see what you have to learn from it. You might mess up sometimes, and you might make mistakes. I know that I have done. The best that you can do with that is say to yourself, that's okay. That's okay. And be open and honest about it. When you do fall down, the best you can do is step up and learn to do better. Another thing to say about this as well is, most of the time when there's a problem or an issue, it's not about blame. It's about, okay, here was a problem. How can we do better? We don't need to feel attacked by somebody coming and saying, I think this was a problem. Or when something goes wrong, we don't need to feel guilty. Instead, let's be productive about it and say, okay, something's gone wrong here. How can we improve on that? This will probably come as no surprise to you, but if you're the maintainer of a project, you probably want a code of conduct. The Python Software Foundation have a code of conduct. I would recommend you link to theirs. Something that is quite helpful about that as well, if you're a project maintainer, is you can say to your users, here's our code of conduct. If you have a problem, you can come and contact me. If you're not comfortable with contacting me about it, please feel free to contact the PSF instead. And that way, you'll hold yourself accountable as well. You'll allow your users to have a route for talking with other people about something if there does happen to be a significant enough problem to require their assistance. Oh, yeah. Look after your mental health. Spending a large amount of time in the digital domain can be really harmful. This can be a particular problem in the open source world because lots of us have this as our hobby as well as our full-time job. Both burnout, but also digital addiction can be really unhealthy and damaging. When you're working in front of screens all day and you're working with analytical abstractions for long periods of time, eventually it rewires your brains. And when you're investing deeply in a particular project, it can take a long time to properly unplug. In the worst case, that might mean burnout. In less obvious ways, it might mean that it's impacting your relationships with people around you, because even though you're not working, part of your brain is still ticking away on some of the problems that it's been working with. It's really important to make sure that you've got healthy routines to go around your open source contributions. Make sure that you're investing in yourself, your time, in balanced ways. Make sure that you are tending to your friendships and your family and your hobbies without getting too sucked into the digital world. Empathy matters. What I wanted to say here is that people won't remember you for what software projects you built or maintained at the end of the day. People will remember you for how you made them feel. There's no point in us doing this work if we're not also looking after each other, respecting each other's different approaches and differing ways of seeing things, showing each other care and empathy. The distance that a screen creates between us doesn't always help with this. It can be much harder to see the person themselves behind an avatar and a username. So I think we need to pay extra attention in the digital space, because we might not be able to read others' feelings anything like as easily as we would in the real world. Take time to be mindful of the language that you're using and check in with folks to try to get a better impression of how your actions online might be affecting them in person. If you're not putting in that work, then if you upset someone unintentionally, you might not notice that until it's too late. And at that point, you've lost them. Next up, no, not next up. Last thing, don't take it too seriously. By this, I don't mean that we should be unprofessional, but let's take a light-hearted approach to what we're doing in this space. It can be really easy when we're thinking about how to solve a problem to get hung up on how we should or how we shouldn't solve this, when really there isn't any should or shouldn't about any of all this. It's all just software. It's this big imaginary hallucination of nothingness and abstraction floating away meaninglessly through the digital cloud. It's not the real world. Thank you.